Between $21 and $32 trillion of private financial wealth is currently hidden off the books. It is completely isolated from the global rule of law.
$32 trillion. Let's really think about that staggering figure. Based on painstaking indirect data triangulation from institutions like the Bank for International Settlements and the IMF, this number represents the subterranean global financial system. It acts as the economic equivalent of an astrophysical black hole. And just like a black hole, it's virtually invisible to the naked eye, meticulously designed by a highly paid, industrious bevy of professional enablers. But what actually happens when we look closely at the data of who owns this wealth versus who owes the world's debt?
Well, it brilliantly illustrates our great macroeconomic paradox. We constantly hear about the crushing debt of the developing world, right? But take a look at this comparison. When analyzing 139 so-called debtor nations, their aggregate gross external public debt stood at roughly $4.08 trillion. Yet the private elites from these exact same countries have accumulated between $7.3 and $9.3 trillion of unrecorded offshore wealth. That means these 139 nations are actually net lenders to the tune of over $10 trillion. The wealth is effectively funneled away by their own elites into offshore vaults, leaving the massive debt burden to be shouldered by everyday, ordinary taxpayers.
Section 1, Genesis of the Haven. To understand how we arrived at a $32 trillion shadow economy, we have to look back over nearly a century of financial evolution.
The timeline of this explainer reveals a highly calculated evolution. It starts all the way back in 1934, when Switzerland leveraged its geopolitical neutrality and passed the Swiss Banking Act. This elevated banking confidentiality into a strict legal creed, essentially turning Swiss banks into the Fort Knox of global capital. Then, during the post-war prosperity of the 1960s, the Caribbean entered the fray as the disruptors. Jurisdictions like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and the Bahamas didn't just copy Europe, they innovated. They introduced asset protection trusts, shell corporations, and hedge fund preeminence. Finally, as the 1980s arrived, we saw the rise of modern Asian fortress economies. Hong Kong utilized its free port status to allow duty-free asset storage, while Singapore added a highly appealing layer of geopolitical stability.
So here is the crucial point to take away from this. A modern tax haven isn't necessarily a physical location. It's not just a sunny tropical island with a lax local government. Today, offshore is a virtual capability. It's a highly portable, multi-jurisdictional network engineered for completely frictionless capital flight, existing entirely in the spaces between national laws.
Notice the deliberate anatomy of the structure here. How does this invisibility actually work in practice? Well, it works through deliberate fragmentation. Step 1, a shell company holds the actual financial asset, whether that's a bank account or real estate. Step 2, that shell company is owned by an anonymous trust located in a completely different second jurisdiction. And step 3, that trust is overseen by trustees located in a third jurisdiction. By fragmenting ownership across multiple global borders, tracing the ultimate beneficial owner becomes a legal and logistical impossibility for tax authorities. Institutional mapping by organizations like the Tax Justice Network reveals a really important reality. True secrecy actually requires access to the high-cost, stable capital markets of the first world. You see, wealthy individuals don't want to leave their billions in a thinly capitalized bank on a small island. They want access to efficient securities markets, independent judiciaries, and the rule of law found in places like London, New York, or Frankfurt. The island havens simply act as conduits. The first world acts as the ultimate destination.
Section 2. Rise of Virtual Sovereignty. We've entered an era where the true custodians of global capital are a highly concentrated group of financial institutions. A wildly disproportionate share of this hidden wealth is directly managed by just 50 top-tier global banks. We're talking about institutions that collectively managed over $12.1 trillion in cross-border invested assets for private clients at the end of 2010. These banks, supported by a tight network of the Big Four accounting firms and elite law practices, entice wealth from both rich and poor countries. And historically speaking, many of these are the exact same institutions that received massive taxpayer bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis.
Looking clinically at the data for our 139 source countries, the concentration of this wealth is pretty striking. A mere 10 nations account for 61% of this extracted offshore capital. The top 20 account for 81%. What this tells us is that this system isn't broadly utilized by the masses. It's a hyper-concentrated service tailored specifically for the ultimate elites of a select group of nations.
Section 3. the onshoring of secrecy. Interestingly, the most profound structural shift today isn't happening overseas, but right inside the world's largest regulatory environments. Looking directly at the United States, specific states like Delaware, Nevada, and South Dakota have aggressively captured market share by offering onshore legal vehicles that successfully shield assets from international oversight. They offer limited liability corporations and asset protection trusts whose levels of secrecy and creditor protection easily rival those of the most traditional opaque island havens. The line between onshore and offshore is rapidly dissolving.
As institutional analyses, like the report The Price of Offshore Revisited, demonstrate, this deliberate blurring of onshore and offshore boundaries makes estimating global capital flight deeply complex. Because the system is protected by official government policies that place data directly off limits, analysts have to use indirect measurements. But even with these limitations, the scale of untaxed earnings on this accumulated wealth is massive. It's capable of replacing initial capital outflows with self-sustaining hidden flight, meaning the wealth now generates enough hidden interest to grow entirely on its own.
Back in April 2009, following the global financial crisis, the G20 confidently declared the era of bank secrecy is over. Yet, despite robust declarations from world leaders, institutional facts prove that the systemic architecture of financial secrecy remains almost entirely intact. Just 5 days after that dramatic statement, the OECD's blacklist of tax havens was officially empty. A true geopolitical miracle, it seems. In reality, the era of bank secrecy didn't end. It merely adapted. Section 4. The future of global capital. We must rationally confront the macroeconomic fallout of these deeply entrenched systems and the paradox of frictionless capital. Standard economic theory assumes capital flows from rich countries to capital-scarce countries. The offshore reality proves the exact opposite is happening. For example, looking purely at corporate taxation data, 50 of the largest U.S. corporations, names like Microsoft, IBM, and Walmart, utilized offshore structures to hold an estimated $1.6 trillion. While these entities generated over $4.2 trillion in global profits, leveraging this offshore framework reduced their effective global tax rate to just 25.90%. This isn't an anomaly. It's the standard operating procedure for preserving corporate wealth in a borderless system.
If this architecture continues to extract wealth from debtor nations into hidden private vaults, we're left with a profound question about the ultimate sustainability of our global financial system. When the responsibilities of society are bypassed by its most resourced participants, the foundations of tax fairness and economic balance are fundamentally altered. Can the global market economy survive when its wealthiest participants reside in a frictionless, borderless reality completely isolated from the rule of law? This is Lex Capital.